I'm Garrett McQueen.
I'm Scott Blankenship.
And this is TRILLOQUY, True and Real Stories from the Fringes of Classical Music. All right, Scott, this is not about to be the coronavirus podcast.
Well, we have to keep up to date somehow.
Right, but that I just want to make it clear to all of the listeners that is not the main point of discussion today by any means. All I'm going to say is that, I urge all of you to continue to think about the folks that are really being impacted in a big way by this crisis, especially the folks in the service industry and the freelance musicians. And in the past two opuses, we've opened up by talking about some funds that are there for relief. I'll offer another one today. So New Music USA, who I have a pretty good relationship with. Shout out to Vanessa Reed, who runs the ship over there. They have what they call a New Music Solidarity Fund. So they're offering $500 emergency grants to performers of music by living composers who have been impacted by the COVID-19 cancellation. So, Scott, $500 isn't gonna buy you a home or anything, but in a pinch, that $500 is $500 more on your rent or some food or whatever you have to utilities, whatever you got going on. So if you're a performing musician and specifically a performer of music by living composers, I really encourage you to take a look at what New Music USA is doing. There will be a link with more information in the description of this opus. I'll just go through a couple of these rules. The New Music Solidarity Fund opens to applicants at noon Eastern on March 31st. So this will have come out after that, and it's going to run until April 30th. So yet another resource for you.
Yeah.
On today's opus of TRILLOQUY, the guest is Rob Deemer. We recorded the interview with him, back at the Sphinx conference. Good, Scott, good thing we backlogged all of these interviews.
It's coming in handy right now, isn't it?
Yeah, with the social distancing and all that sort of thing. And I don't want to spend too much time chit-chatting about that, but I want to go back to Sam Bergman's opus for a second. So the first time that I heard some of the statistics by Rob Deemer, it was through Sam. He just kind of offhandedly said that orchestras are performing more music by Beethoven than by all women composers,
Right.
And that's something that kind of hit me, obviously, but I needed some time to let that marinate to actually realize what that means. So when I hosted one of the panels I hosted at the Sphinx conference back in February, I brought in some of Rob Deemer's research and highlighted that fact specifically, the fact that, again, orchestras are performing more Beethoven than they are women, period. And
I thought it was women, people of color. Basically, they scooped every minority together, and Beethoven still outpaced them.
Right. It's really crazy, and I got a lot of feedback after that panel from folks who just did not realize, including the current artistic director of the Orpheus Chamber Orchestra. So shout out to them. But it's things like that we really need to highlight if we're talking about actual change and actual equity in classical music. I know this is Beethoven 2020, the 250th anniversary, but there are so many other composers, and one of the points that you'll hear Rob make in the interview is that we're not asking for folks to cancel Beethoven or cancel all of the quote-unquote mainstream composers. Yeah, the war horses. We're just saying, and folks like Rob Deemer are just saying that taking one of those Beethoven symphonies or two of those Beethoven symphonies off of your season schedule will open up so much room for music that folks may not know. As you'll hear, Rob Deemer is a Barry sax player turned composer in college. A project that he had for some of his students, as far as compiling data, what the orchestras in America are doing. He realized that was a bigger project than just a student project.
Right.
So he took that on, and fast forward, the Institute for Composer Diversity was born. That is an excellent resource that I have have used personally. You know, folks are always saying, well, who are these composers and how can we find out how to make our programming more diverse? We just don't know who these composers are. And the Institute for Composer Diversity website is that place. So I'll put a link to that in the description of this opus for you to discover what Rob is doing over in upstate New York. SUNY Fredonia, I believe, is where he works. So we talk about that. We talk a little bit about some music. You know, he very politely wouldn't
answer what new composer he was excited about.
Right, and I do appreciate his response because all of the new composers are important. So again, I really encourage you to go over to the description of this opus to find the Institute for Composer Diversity website and check out what they've put together.
Also important to mention that Rob has a background in radio. He said that he was a public radio announcer for a little bit
down in Oklahoma.
Okay, so he has that side of it, but meaning that, he's steeped in music. He's not just a statistician or, some sort of a numbers guy. He also understands the music, the art piece,
right?
Too.
And again, as I've already mentioned, he's an instrumentalist, a composer. At the end of the opus, Scott, I remember now he actually did shout out a couple composers, Duke Ellington. I don't think he said Dizzy Gillespie. I'm forgetting the other composer he named, maybe Miles Davis. So just very quickly before we get into the conversation with Rob, I wonder, you have a background in jazz radio as well. When it comes to the war horses, the so-called war horses in that category, it seems like Duke Ellington, Miles Davis, and all those folks. They, do you see it, from your perspective, is it equitable to focus on them? Is Duke Ellington the Beethoven of the jazz world? And when it comes to diversifying the art form and the aural aesthetic?
I don't know, because when I was the jazz director at the station that I moved here from, I was not trying hard at all to miss Miles Davis or John Coltrane. My favorite things was frequent.
The John Coltrane, my favorite things.
Right. It's like 18 minutes long or something like that,
Well, legally, we can listen to about 30 seconds of it now. So how about we do that to transition into our conversation with Rob Deemer? Rob Deemer, thanks so much for being on TRILLOQUY with us today. It's a pleasure to have you.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
As folks listening right now can hear, it sounds like you have a voice for media or public radio. Have you ever done anything like that?
I actually have. Several years ago, before I moved out to Western New York, I actually had a radio show in Oklahoma called The Composer Next Door, where I did that for a couple of years, kind of featuring living composers around the country.
Oh, wow. What was the feedback that you would get for a show like that?
It was actually surprisingly positive. Because, I was trying to especially find composers all over the country in states that people might not have heard of. And there were all of these composers around the country who were like, "Wait, you're putting me on the radio in Oklahoma?" and a lot of the folks in Oklahoma really loved it, so it was surprising.
Yeah, talk a little bit about that. What is you don't associate Oklahoma with the classical music scene. What was the scene like there?
Well, it's actually funny. There's in Oklahoma City and in Norman, where I was teaching for a year, and then I taught at Oklahoma City for a year. There's actually a strong, thriving music scene. It's just not as maybe as publicly known as in some of the other states where it gets a little bit more attention. And I found myself being in Oklahoma for a year longer than I thought I was going to be, and so I'd always wanted to do a radio show and pitched it to the NPR station there in Edmond, Oklahoma, and the guy went for it. So,
shout out to them.
Good to hear.
That's actually how I got to know a lot of composers around the country, because I just contacted them. This was back in like 2006. And I just sent a bunch of emails saying, "Hey, can I put your music on the radio?" And hundreds of CDs later, then I found myself with this kind of network of kind of knowing everybody. They're like, "Oh, you're that guy with the radio show in Oklahoma." I'm like, "Yeah." Whatever works.
When I started my radio career, something that I was very actively thinking about was the fact that when I think of classical radio, I'm thinking of a sound that doesn't really relate to my experience as a musician.
Yeah.
And I have to, put into account that, as a bassoonist coming up in the band world, because it's band music, it's going to be more contemporary just automatically.
Right.
But yeah, I'm glad to hear that you had success with new music on the radio.
Well, and it was fun because that was really the beginning of my first interest, which was to kind of advocate for living composers, because it seemed like, I grew up in the Midwest, about an hour and a half outside of Chicago, and other than a few performances at the university there, I didn't really know that many living composers.
Right.
And so when I got out there after I did my doctorate, that was the kind of the start of all of this stuff. Was first thinking about living composers, and then later on, I kind of focused it a little bit with my new initiative.
Yeah, and and you're advocating for composers and new music. The other side of that is calling out the institutions that aren't advocating, and that's we're going to go into that here in a bit, and talk about how you got into this sort of data collection corner of classical music. Would you call yourself a statistician? Or?
Oh God, no. Anyone who I think I took one stats class back in my undergrad, and my teacher there would definitely not call me a statistician, but maybe a data collector. And I don't know. I'm still learning how to analyze it all.
D for data collector.
Yeah, exactly. But at least I'm getting the information and putting it out in a way that people can digest it.
Yeah. A few opuses back, Scott, we had Sam Bergman on, and he brought up a stat that found underrepresented composers, women composers of color, when it comes to their music being programmed in American orchestras, it doesn't quite match the number of performances of music only by Beethoven. For me, that was just a shocking stat to learn. Are there other stats that you found are shocking for people to hear?
Well, yeah. First, to give context, I started looking at programs back last February in 2019.
So just going on the internet and looking
just
what all the
literally
orchestras are
going
doing.
on the internet. And first I was like, oh, I'll hit the big orchestras. And I'm like, wait a minute, if we're really going to do this right, I want to be able to get a really good sample size. Because I had an inkling that orchestras that were maybe a little bit further down the budget size ladder might be doing things a little bit differently than some of the really large budget orchestras. And so, basically I started in February. I think I finally stopped in May or June at 120 orchestras around the country.
Wow.
And then so those were the numbers that I've been kind of working with my work with the Institute for Composer Diversity to be able to look at things like, okay, Beethoven had 400 something performances this year. And then looking at, okay, how many women composers and how many composers of color. And the number of underrepresented composers, if you combine all of those, is just a hair's breadth above all of the performances with Beethoven. If you parse it down a little bit more, there's almost as many performances of Mozart's work as there are of all composers of color.
Wow.
And so it really kind of points to how, even though, and we can talk about this in a little bit, the numbers of underrepresented composers are actually better this year than they have been in the past.
Yeah.
But there's still this habit by programmers to really lean on the usual suspects, as I call them.
Right. And even if putting IED, I never know what order to put those three letters in, but
Oh, sure.
IED, DIE, in that conversation, just pushing that to the side.
Sure.
So much Beethoven means that there is also no Khachaturian being programmed, Kavalevsky, these other, even the European composers who were given a backseat to so that we can hear Beethoven 4 one more time or Beethoven 9 one more time.
Well, and this year is obviously a little different because of the 250th anniversary of Beethoven.
Yeah.
So that's what's it's an interesting year to get started looking at these numbers, because then we want to see, all right, what happens in 21, 22 and 22, 23 after we get outside of this Beethoven fervor. I'm not sure what it's going to look like. However, looking back at some of the numbers that the Baltimore Symphony did, because when they were doing some similar analysis a few years ago, and I think the numbers that I saw were actually even higher than they are this year.
Goodness gracious.
Yeah, I think it was up into the 600s back then.
Oh, my goodness.
Because there wasn't as much push for women composers and composers of color. Back then, the numbers for them were like at 1% to 2% as kind of an average across the board over 80 orchestras that they analyzed. And this year, the numbers for women composers are at 8%, and composers of color at 6%. So you look at those numbers in and of itself, it's not great.
Yeah.
But you compare it to what it was maybe 3-4 years ago, and you're like, wow, that's like triple or quadruple what it was. So it's these are some of the kind of the balances that I'm trying to look at in terms of what's the good news and what's the bad news, and what are some of the things that we can do to nudge folks to do it better.
Yeah. When you talked about going through all of those orchestras and looking at their programs, a question I thought of, I wonder if you saw any geographic data that was interesting. I mean, did you see that, this area is really concentrated with orchestras?
Mm-hmm.
It seems like maybe there aren't as many ensembles maybe in South Dakota or in Montana, Idaho.
Sure. I think there's obviously more orchestras on the eastern half of the of the United States than west.
Our universe.
Yeah, universe. But in general, actually, what was fascinating is to kind of dig down deeper into the list of orchestras. I used the League of American Orchestras, their kind of budget categorization of them, going through like the first 5 groups of them by budget size. And it was really fascinating, not only to see how many orchestras there are, which surprised me. I didn't realize there were that many, but also how actually kind of, the folks a little bit further down, group 3s, group 4s, group 5s, that don't have quite the tradition and probably the older, well-to-do donor base in some of the smaller cities, they actually have a lot more flexibility to do some really interesting things programming-wise.
Yeah.
And it's been interesting to see kind of how difficult it is for some of those larger orchestras that have 80, 90, 100 works performed or programmed in a season. It's much more difficult for them to be able to move their numbers than orchestras that are 30, 40, or 50 programmed works.
Right, yeah, and we're definitely going to circle back around to that conversation.
Sure.
But you said that you grew up about an hour and a half outside of Chicago.
Yeah,
Is that where an instrument was put in your hands for the first time? How'd you get started?
So I'm from DeKalb, Illinois, where Northern Illinois University is, and it had a really good school of music. And I remember watching concerts when I was a kid, actually going in and seeing the Chicago Symphony.
Okay.
And just always had this sense of I wanted to do music, and for whatever reason, I thought saxophone was the thing to do.
You're a sax player.
I am a saxophone player. Baritone saxophone was my main instrument for many, many years. But then even in high school, I was both, I started writing big band charts, doing arrangements. I didn't know anything about composing. That came much later, but at least the idea of taking other people's music and then doing stuff with it. And then picked up a bunch of other instruments, flute, clarinet, tuba, of all things.
As sax players tend to do.
Yeah. It was fun. And actually coming at it from the jazz point of view, I played in band, and maybe every once in a while in an orchestra, but, high school and then even into college, jazz was originally my main interest. And, when I went into undergrad, I thought I was going to be a high school band director in suburban Chicago.
Yeah.
I had no idea that I was A, going to be a composer, and B, I would definitely not have known all of the other stuff that I've been doing over the years.
I wonder what you think about how the instrument that you choose, or in many cases, the instrument that chooses you, impacts the perspective on classical music, quote unquote. I think before we turned the microphones on, we were talking about the fact that I came up in the band world, so my ear was, developed through more contemporary music than maybe if I had started on Suzuki violin. I'm sure as a sax player, that path looked even different.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the fact that, from my instrument, I had next to no experience as a kid, probably not even into college, about playing much Mozart or Brahms or Beethoven or any of what we considered to be kind of the prototypical, canonic composers.
Yeah.
So yeah, between either playing in jazz band or playing in concert band, you loved music, but you had this sense of, oh, but there's this kind of special group of composers and this special group of pieces that you can go listen to, but that I would never be able to actually integrate or interact with.
Yeah.
And I think in part that is it really wasn't until I started conducting much later that I at least started to be able to face that dilemma, and even composing. If the first time I had to write a string quartet, I'm like, what am I supposed to do with this?
Yeah. Right.
Because I hadn't grown up playing it or listening to it in the same way that I had grown up listening to Thelonious Monk and Duke Ellington.
Right. You said that you were going to, be a band director. That was what I thought I was going to do too, but things change. What sort of inspired that shift?
Well, it was pretty sudden, to be perfectly honest.
Okay.
I wrote a couple big band charts for the arranging class at Northern Illinois University, where I was doing my undergrad, and I always knew about the Downbeat Student Music Awards.
Okay.
And I thought, I've written these two big band charts, an arrangement of Come Sunday by Duke Ellington, and I took a Thelonious Monk tune and kind of really ran with it and kind of stretched it out to the point where it was hardly recognizable as the Monk tune. And I sent it in, and I remember, they had this rule that you could only send in one per category. They had an arranging category and what they called an extended composition category.
Okay.
And I'm like, well, I haven't composed. My teacher's like, well, just send it in, see what happens. And that won. It was the college winner
goodness.
across the entire country.
Mm.
And that kind of woke me up to be like, wait a minute.
You became famous overnight.
Well, and it really kind of woke me up because I was 23, and I had no idea what composing was.
Yeah.
No one had ever shown me what composing was. And I literally won this National Composition Award and didn't even know what composing was. And so
goodness.
it kind of got me thinking, all right, maybe I could do this for a living. And so the next couple of years, as I finished up my undergrad, then I kind of switched my sights to composing. But even back then, I was like, well, I could never actually become like a real composer, because quote unquote, because I wasn't Mozart. I wasn't writing things when I was 10. I had this real deep assumption that you had to have been a composer from birth in order to do it. And so I thought, all right, I will go be John Williams. And so I applied for and got into the film scoring program at University of Southern California.
Oh yeah, go Trojans, fight on.
Oh yeah, and I lived in LA for 3 years.
Oh.
And did film scoring before I finally decided maybe should go take a composition lesson and actually learn what that was like.
Yeah.
And then, I missed education. I missed teaching. And so that's when I decided to go back and go do my graduate studies in composition.
Okay. Well, I didn't know that we had the USC connection.
There you go.
I lived at Slauson and La Brea during my time. So developing yourself and your ideas around composition, is there a connection between that and the work that folks know you for now, as far as this data collection and talking about the way orchestras are programming?
I think because I got into composition through several back doors, right? It allows me to not have this sense of, here's this body of work that should not be touched and that cannot be moved. It allows for me to just look at things like, there's all of this different kind of music that's been written by all of these different composers, and I kind of see it all as really good, but not really thinking of it hierarchically in that way. And so it allows for me to be able to kind of, I think some folks would be like, how could you possibly not play this particular piece or that particular composer? And I'm like, very easily.
Yeah.
It's really easy.
Like
you just
this,
don't
press
do
play.
it.
Yeah.
Delete. Or you just like choose not to play. And it's and one of the things that we've been doing is not advocating completely deleting the canon. It's just, the canon shouldn't be so large that it isolates and pushes aside all of these other voices.
That's one of the things that I find is that when you talk about bringing new music or living composers onto the air, like when we do our air shifts, the knee-jerk reaction seems to be it's at the expense of the canon.
Yep.
And that's not necessarily, you're saying that's not what you're advocating for.
It is not a zero-sum game.
Right.
The idea of bringing in more voices from different groups and different experiences, to be honest, I mean, that's what we should be doing.
Yeah.
Because if we want to actually bring in more audiences, both listeners on the radio and audiences in the concert halls, as well as reflecting our quickly diversifying demographics in the student body, you're either going to chase everybody away, or just I hate the conversations folks have about dying, classical music dying.
They've been saying that for decades.
Of course, but there is that idea of like, if you allow for 20 or 40 or 60 composers from a very specific time period and geographical reason to basically have a chokehold on all the music that you're listening to, sooner or later that's not sustainable. At some point it's going to change. Either the folks who are listening to it just tire or go away, or all of that stuff. So this is hopefully going to encourage folks to be able to bring in a lot more a much larger listening base for all of this stuff, and hopefully then we'll encourage more students, younger people who are women and students of color, to start learning how to compose early on, and then that will grow the canon as we do.
Right.
But to be fair, a part of the conversation that I think we never actually get into is that to further diversify and integrate more people into the canon, quote unquote, or into the concert programs, into the radio programs, there is music that has to go away. It's not only addition. We have to talk about what this music is taking the place of. Is that something that you've kind of thought about?
Absolutely. And
so who do we need to throw away? Tell us.
Well, I wouldn't point at any particular names. I will admit in the analysis that we did this year, there were numerous orchestras that programmed 10 or more works, as many as 16 works in one season by Beethoven. Not to kick Ludwig. I mean, I like him. I've actually conducted numerous of his works. And I would never say to not ever program him, but that's a lot.
Yeah.
Even if, let's say, if you have 90 programmed works in your season, and 15 of them are by one guy, that's kind of out of balance.
I'm trying to think what it would be.
If you put that in radio terms, the frequency that comes around, that would be like. On oldies radio, that would be like, let's just say Buddy Holly, a Buddy Holly song coming on every 30 or 40 minutes.
I would think, that's a lot.
That's a lot.
That's a lot. And so one of the we've been trying to slowly build strategies and best practices to kind of not just saying, hey, do better, but actually give folks tools, both resources, but then also strategies on how to be able to change it. And one of the strategies that I've kind of come to a realization that might work is for when orchestras, and when I say orchestras, I'm just thinking all ensembles, all programmers.
Sure.
But because it can be mapped onto practically anything. But to think of it intentionally before you even start programming and give yourself some goals when you're programming. And one of those goals can be no more than X number of works by any one composer. So say for a small orchestra, it might be 2. For a large orchestra, maybe 3 or 4 at the max. I think that that 2 to 4 is like, because even if, let's say, you have 80 works in your season, 4 works, that's sizable. You can go and hear Mozart or Brahms 4 weeks out of the year. That's not bad. Every other week might be a bit much. And so by doing that, and we actually did some numbers. It would have, let's say, if we just said no more than 2, for all of the orchestras that we looked at, it would have opened up over 450 slots for different works.
Right.
So those are the type of strategies where you're like, all you have to do is just limit yourself here and then kind of give yourself a goal here. And then when you're starting to make your decisions, you're working within those confines, and then it doesn't feel like you're necessarily pulling someone out of a list.
Sure.
You're just kind of adjusting the list that you're building.
Sure. Yeah, and a couple seconds ago, when I asked what does that look like when an orchestra programs 15 works by Beethoven, what are these works? I mean, are you doing all of the symphonies plus the choral fantasy plus a concerto here or there? I mean,
pretty much. Especially in this anniversary year, that's exactly what folks are doing. Every one of the symphonies,
wow.
Every one of the piano concertos, the violin concertos, many, if not all, of the overtures. It's sizable.
And not to mention that the violin concerto is something like 40 minutes, 42 minutes. Like we don't air it all that often in its entirety because that would take up most of the hour.
And the 9th is basically, that's your evening.
Yeah,
right there.
yeah, that as well. I'm wondering, what keeps you so fired up about this work? Because many people would look at you and see someone who isn't representative of one of these marginalized communities. So why have you dedicated so much of your time to this?
That's a great question. Well, the entire project started several years ago in 2016 when I basically started a project for my students that I teach at State University of New York at Fredonia. I thought, hey, this would be a good resource for them to find women composers. And so I started a spreadsheet with just names and links to their website. And I started off with 200 names. And as I was doing that, I'm like, hey, it would be great if they could search by different parameters. They could have look for composers who weren't living anymore, or where they were living, like what state or city, or what genre of music they were writing, or even what their racial and ethnic demographics were. And then as I was doing that, I'm like, wait a minute, this isn't a student project. This could be something that was useful for everyone. And then over the years, that kind of grew to include all of composers of color, and now we're going to be including LGBTQ composers as well into that. And why? I think it kind of goes back to when I was talking about the radio show. I'd already kind of had this mindset of kind of advocating for living composers in my writing for New Music Box and the radio show and all of these things. But then looking at the numbers and realizing how living composers did not have it great, but underrepresented composers, that was obnoxious.
Sure.
And so it was just like, well, let me try and see if I can help things out. And then as it went along and finding out how much of a gap there was, there pretty much was very few resources that people could use to search and browse and discover new composers and then new works. And as I've been doing this, I'll tell you, I love teaching and I love composing, but I don't know if I've ever done anything that has been as satisfying as it is to be able to allow folks to be able to have their works discovered, and to have all of these conductors and educators come to me and be like, I can't believe all of these new, pieces of music that I had never known about.
Yeah.
And it's not that they weren't there. It's just they don't even know where to find, to start to look for them.
Right.
And so, it seems like a relatively easy and simple thing to do. But as I've been going down this path, I'm starting to discover all of the systems that are creating barriers for this. And I always like puzzles, which is part of the reason why I like composing. But by trying to figure out how to be able to both convince people through advocacy and then also, analyze the systems by which these inequities are happening, it's amazing. It's to be able to know that I'm helping things across the country.
Yeah.
Is something that I would have never even guessed that I would be able to do. And at this point, I kind of describe it as I have the tiger by the tail, and now I'm just a matter of like, okay, I guess this is what I'm doing for the foreseeable future, and let's dig deep into it.
Yeah. Yeah.
In a past opus, we talked about, it was Kathleen Bradbury.
Yeah.
She makes the point of when you grow up or work in a system with flaws, it is difficult to see that flaw because you're in it. Okay, so you obviously have had this clarity come about. What would you say to people who are trying to be an ally in this and are trying to help people of color, people of the LGBTQ plus communities get their music played, even down to somebody like me? What would you say to the possible ally?
There's a lot there. I think I never really use the term ally because it kind of feels like I'm intending to be a thing. I'm just seeing it as, dude, this is the right thing to do. And not trying to attempt to be someone out there. I guess in
that's a
terms
good
of
point.
the motives,
Yeah.
It's to give an example, one of the habits that ensembles have been doing the last few years is to focus. They will take an entire concert and they will focus on African American composers or women composers, often in February or in March because of those things.
Yep.
Right.
And it will feel to them, I think, I'm kind of projecting, but I am assuming that they're feeling like that's what we should do. We should do something that's nice and public, and it's
Get it out of the way.
And get it out of the way, but it's also this nice, neatly wrapped package of
Sure.
and here's our diversity package right over here. And that's tough because okay, well, that's better than not doing it at all. But at the same time, what happens is that they're not listening to the people who they are trying to help. And I know from having heard from many of my colleagues who are women and composers of color for years, they hate being on those concerts because, for all of the reasons, it's being isolated, you're being quote unquote special, and the idea of, if you want to do it right, the biggest thing is to just normalize it.
Yeah, I've
So
been
that it's across the board, and it shouldn't be any more quote unquote special to have a work by Courtney Bryant or Jennifer Higdon, on a concert than Brahms or Stravinsky.
I've been asking a lot of people that question. Is it more equitable in your eyes to have these pieces all throughout the seasons or in special concerts? And the overwhelming response is all throughout, followed very closely by both.
Right.
Yes, sure. And there's, in the same way that you see, concerts where they'll be like, here's a bunch of Russian composers.
Right.
It's very easy for them. Or here's the French composers. Yay. But it's kind of like, but you can't treat women, let's say women composers like that. Right?
Yeah.
Because there's a whole lot of women composers,
Yeah.
and to be able to kind of isolate them in the same way that you would say a concert with Ravel and Debussy and all those, and then say, okay, we're done, check, and then go on to the next thing. Ultimately, the analogy that I like to use is back about 15 years ago when the country was moving away from smoking in bars. Mm-hmm. And I was living in Texas and in Oklahoma during that time. And I remember it was really a big deal.
Sure. Oh, yeah, sure.
For the idea of like, what do you mean I can't smoke in this bar? And then you look at the world now, 15 years later, and if you lit a cigarette in a bar, people would be like, what are you doing?
Right.
They would look at you like the culture has shifted.
Yeah.
It took some time, but that culture shifted to the point now where if you did that, it would be very obvious. And I think that's hopefully what we're trying to do.
Yeah.
The idea of looking at a season and being like, having just a handful of composers of color or a handful of women composers, we should react to that in the same way as if someone lit up a cigar in a bar today,
Yeah.
or in a restaurant. You don't want to have to smell cigarette smoke
Exactly.
while you're having dinner. Same. I mean, it's a weird analogy, but at the same time,
No, I
it's
get
that
it, yeah.
kind of cultural shift that will take time.
Yeah.
Both through just changing minds, but then also changing policies and procedures.
Yeah.
I can't let you go without getting back to a conversation that we kind of touched on earlier. So, I spent 5 seasons with the Knoxville Symphony, a smaller organization. And I have to say, shout out to Aram Demerjen. He really programs thinking about these things. I remember on the last 4th of July Pops that I played down there, we featured Florence Price's Dances in the Cane Breaks. That makes it through our playlist every now and again, Scott. And, just my thinking about the fact that, wow, is this the first time I've ever performed a black composer on a 4th of July Pops? Now, if you go here, I'm just going to name some orchestras. If you go to hear the Boston Pops on 4th of July, or even if you go hear the Chicago Symphony any time of year, that programming is going to be much more rigid. It seems like it's the smaller organizations that are really taking the bull by the horn, so to speak, and working to change things in a real way and not just have the conversations. I get so frustrated, and when you talk about the way that we conceptually rank these orchestras, how music students practice to hope so that they can hopefully get a job with the New York Phil, LA Phil, even though these are the organizations that really aren't doing the work, quote unquote, that they could be doing with as much visibility they have. Is this something that you've considered as well?
Absolutely. And I think it's because they have a little bit more flexibility. They don't have quite as much pressure coming at them from, say, their boards or their donor base. But also, I think I'm seeing more and more of these smaller kind of mid-tier orchestras really making it a priority. And there are some orchestras that have really taken that.
Oh, yeah.
I'm thinking River Oaks Chamber Orchestra down in Houston, Albany Symphony, Chicago Symphonietta. Those are three that they have set that as a priority, and they are running with it. But then you look at some of these other orchestras that also have some really good, I wouldn't even say diverse, but just balanced programming around the country, and that's not an accident because you don't just accidentally program all of these living and diverse composers. You have to really put some thought into it.
Yeah.
And the fact that you're seeing a fair chunk of those kind of mid-tier orchestras doing it, I'm hoping that kind of then resonates up into some of the top tier orchestras.
Trickle up.
Trickle up, exactly. And I am seeing that even just in the last couple of weeks, I've been looking at St. Louis Symphony and Los Angeles Philharmonic. Those numbers, compared to what it was even 3 and 4 or 5 years ago, have increased dramatically. And it's because I think they have put that priority out there, and it's a little bit more work, and it might take a little bit more time for them to get their audiences on board. But ultimately, if they're setting that as a priority, they're going to do it.
Yeah, and because, as you just said, the intentional programming, the intentionality behind it, in 2020, it's it's getting harder and harder for the season that has no diversity on it to not look intentional, and which will in turn mean I'm not coming to the concert, and how that just trickles out everywhere. So, in closing here, are there any of these institutions that you are working to collaborate with, large orchestras, maybe even schools, colleges, universities?
Sure. Well, I have. It's been fun because I've been able to find a lot of collaborators, both individuals working with me on my team. We have a number of folks across the country working with us both on the analytical front and then also helping to do data entry for our databases, which are huge. We've already got a composer database and a works database, and that's going to be growing exponentially over the next couple of years. But we've been talking a lot. I mean, I've been talking especially with organizations like the National Association for Music Educators. That is going to be a strong partnership, because it's great to be able to change things at the professional level, but I truly believe that if we can change how students are exposed to diverse programming at an early age all the way through K-12, then by the time they get into higher ed, and then you need to change that as well, by the time they get into the professional world, it will be normalized. It won't be nearly as special. It will just be expected. It's part of their makeup. And so that may take 10 or 15 years to be able to move those needles. But yeah, we've been talking, especially with American Composers Forum, working a lot with American Composers Orchestra, to be able to find ways to be able to kind of work these things around. And then I've had a number of other orchestras kind of connect with me and kind of ask questions and be like, hey, what can we do a little bit? Do you have some suggestions? And so it's going to take a little while for those things to happen, but it's definitely feeling like it's going in the right direction.
Yeah, and we really appreciate the work you're doing in that regard.
Before we give you the space to give all your contact information and everything, I want to know what composer you're really excited about that might be new to the people that are listening to the podcast right now.
Oh my goodness.
You're going to make someone really happy and a lot of people really mad.
So I will politically deflect that. Because and I really do feel this is how I address this to anyone who asks. I am a white straight male with tenure. I am like the poster child of all that is not what we're trying to push.
You and I.
And so right. And so the last thing I want to do is either create the perception or really be anything related to a gatekeeper, quote unquote. I don't want to be like, oh, here's my favorite cohort of composers. So if someone asks me, hey, can you help us out? I will give them a list of 20 or 30 composers that I will have gone through and tried to find a good balance of both gender and identity and heritage, and then really kind of let them come up with their own, because I have my own proclivities, but the idea of literally what we're trying to do is ask people to not think of who are your favorite composers, because that's your favorite composer. We just the idea of a conductor going, okay, I'm going to program these works because I like these works. I'm kind of like, how about you find what your audiences, or even the people who aren't your audiences yet, might like,
That's
and
good.
then program those.
Well, let me ask you this then. You talked about how Barry Sachs is your primary.
Sure.
What's a Barry Sachs feature or a Barry Sachs tune that we can all just go listen to today to refresh ourselves on that
Oh
sound?
my goodness! All right, so the one that pops into my head really quick is "Moanin'"
Moanin'.
by Charles Mingus. Go listen to that. Either the original with Pepper Adams or some of the newer recordings by the Mingus Band. I would say go back to the original with Pepper Adams playing Barry sax, and
A lot of smoking in those clubs and bars back then.
and Mingus, Monk, and Ellington were my three early favorite composers, and that would be a wonderful send off.
We got him to shout out some composers. We did it, Scott.
Right on.
So how can everyone check out some of this data you've compiled, be involved with the Composer Diversity Project and all those things?
So the Institute for Composer Diversity we are located at the State University of New York at Fredonia. You can find us at composerdiversity.com. Easiest way to then connect with us on Twitter at Composer Project, or on Facebook. You can look up the Institute and find us there. And my contact information is on the site. If we have forms for folks to be able to send in suggestions or questions, or even if you know of composers that would be good to add to the thing, there's a form for folks to fill that out as well.
Nice.
Rob, thank you so much for being here. It's been a pleasure.
Absolutely. Garrett and Scott, thank you so much.
Thanks. You know, Rob had a little bit of difficulty getting to Detroit. The weather was fierce up in New York State at that time, and he was
it
driving.
Sure was. Yeah.
But it was great to have him come in, and what an illuminating conversation, too. I'm so glad that he put that project together and found such rich data to show us exactly where the blind spots are in live orchestral music.
And what an honor to have him on TRILLOQUY. We talk about change makers, arts leaders. He is that. If anyone is, he is that, So, again, I really encourage you to go take a look at the Institute for Composer Diversity website. While you're in the description of this opus, again, don't forget to find out more information about the relief fund that New Music USA has put out for musicians who have been financially impacted by the coronavirus. And a really great conversation with him. I hope to see the change that he is initiating.
Yeah, fingers crossed.
Yeah. So, Scott, a lot to be excited about for April, upcoming opuses of TRILLOQUY. At this point, we've already recorded the very special 420 opus, so I'm excited about that. That will feature John Del Vento. He is a composer who actually composes music for a show I watch every week, Love and Hip Hop. Shout out to you if you watch Love and Hip Hop, whichever city is your favorite. I think I prefer Atlanta. And then we also have interviews. We also have a two-parter scheduled with Brandon Keith Brown, who is quite infamous these days. He was fired from Brown University as their music director and claimed racial bias. That got lots of pushback on both sides. So looking forward to speaking with him. And I think we're going to round out April's opuses of TRILLOQUY with a conversation I had with Amari Ford, who lives down in Oklahoma, Rob Deemer's former stomping grounds.
Yeah.
And he's trying to put together a music camp, considering that we'll still be able to have those this summer, with everything that's going on in the news and everything. So, yeah, lots of really great stuff coming up in April. I personally encourage you to, give us a comment, click 5 stars or however many stars you think we deserve. As we approach the first full year of TRILLOQUY,
it's wild.
It's really nuts that we have managed to stay consistent week to week, considering everything that's happened. So we really appreciate having you along as a listener, and can't wait to have you here next time. So we'll see you then.
And remember, you can also reach out if you have any questions, comments, slanderous remarks. TRILLOQUY at AmericanPublicMedia.org.
Don't worry about bleeping out the curse words either. I can take it. I'm a big boy.
Yeah.
See y'all next time.